in the sealed vaults of forgotten ministries, in folders marked top secret and stamped with the crests of powers long vanished, lies a darker record of the Second World War, one that official history rarely acknowledges. The documents smell of dust, iron, and decay, their edges frayed from decades of silence. Each page bears the weight of signatures erased from memory, inked orders that condemned thousands without trial, and coded messages transmitted in the dead of night to stations already lost to advancing armies. It is here, in these archives of betrayal, where the true story of the war emerges, not of flags raised and victory parades, but of shadow negotiations, secret corridors beneath ruined cities, and pacts made in the language of blood and survival. These truths were not intended for public eyes. They were written for men in sealed rooms, carried by couriers who often disappeared, and buried under layers of propaganda that assured civilians the war was righteous and clear. Yet the paper does not lie. It whispers of convoys that vanished without trace, of spies executed in silence and erased from the record, of allies who stalled their advance to watch cities burn for strategic gain. And it reminds us that the war was not simply fought on the battlefield, but in shadows, where power was traded like currency and lives were expendable lines in coded directives. Tonight, we open those sealed files and uncover the forbidden pages of a war we thought we knew. Chapter 1: The Forgotten Pact, Beneath Warsaw Streets. The city of Warsaw, in September 1939, was no longer a capital. It was a graveyard in the making. Bomb craters split its avenues, fire licked the roofs of churches, and tens of thousands of civilians hid in basements choking with dust and fear. Yet beneath this devastation, far below the rubble-strewn streets, another war was being waged. Recently declassified Soviet cables marked File Z44 Crimson reveal that the city's underground sewer systems became not only a lifeline for resistance, but also a conduit for betrayal. The Gestapo and the NKVD, sworn enemies in later years, had in those first weeks carved out a secret arrangement. Corridors under Warsaw where coded documents, prisoner lists, and economic manifests were exchanged away from the cameras of propaganda. What the world above believed to be chaos was, in the depths, a careful alignment of brutality. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed on August 23, 1939, is widely known to history. Official accounts describe its public face: a non-aggression treaty that allowed Hitler and Stalin to divide Poland between them. But buried within Gestapo interrogation notes and NKVD transmission logs is a lesser-known extension. It described temporary tactical cooperation, not just in partition, but in the controlled sharing of intelligence networks. Gestapo File 211, recovered from a burned archive in Poznan and later translated by Allied cryptanalysts, spoke of transit agreements through urban channels, words cold and clinical but carrying a human cost. These passages were not meant for goods alone. They carried the fates of men and women marked for elimination. Dissidents, journalists, and Catholic priests were identified, numbered, and scheduled like shipments. In the shadows, Berlin and Moscow moved in step, even as their ideologies declared themselves irreconcilable. The evidence begins with the testimony of a Polish railway worker, Janusz Kwiatkowski, who in 1947 told investigators from the new Polish Ministry of Security that he had once been ordered by Soviet agents to escort sealed crates through sewer tunnels near Nowy Świat Street. The crates, he said, bore German writing but were stamped with Soviet seals. He never knew their contents, but the men who guarded them carried both Lugers and Tokarevs, weapons from opposite camps pointed in the same direction, at him. His testimony was dismissed at the time as unreliable, the delirium of a man broken by the war. Yet when matched decades later with a recovered Soviet cable from Minsk, detailing joint courier transfer through Warsaw routes, September 27, 1939, his words no longer seemed like fantasy. They aligned too precisely with the surviving fragments of File Z44. The involvement of Friedrich Jeckeln, later infamous for orchestrating massacres in the Baltics, is confirmed in German army communications. A decrypted Wehrmacht message, recorded by British wireless units on October 1, 1939, described Jeckeln's presence at Underground Exchange Point, Warsaw Sector, an admission never included in his post-war trial transcripts at Riga. Equally damning is the name Lavrenti Tsanova, an NKVD handler whose own file was marked with a red, obliterated stamp after his suspicious death in 9:55, Tsanova's signature appears on requisition forms ordering Polish prisoner manifest to be duplicated and forwarded under seal. The lists matched, entry for entry, those later discovered at Katyn, where thousands of Polish officers and intellectuals were executed in 1940. The connection between sewer transfers and mass executions is impossible to ignore. To visualize the scene, one must imagine the city above in ruins. Searchlights swept through smoke-filled skies as German artillery reduced Warsaw to submission. Yet underground, lamps hung from hooks driven into damp brick walls illuminated the unholy transaction between two states dividing a nation. The stench of sewage mixed with ink, leather satchels, and fear. German officers in grey field coats stood alongside Soviet couriers wearing red stars hidden beneath civilian jackets. They spoke little, using hand signals and brief exchanges in halting German. The goods changed hands in silence, and then each party vanished back into their own shadows. It was not alliance. It was convenience born of conquest. The suppressed files also indicate that the intelligence exchanged was not limited to Poland. Petroleum shipments from Romania, vital to both Nazi and Soviet war machines, were tracked in meticulous detail. British diplomatic codes, stolen from the embassy in Warsaw during its hurried evacuation, were reportedly transferred via these same routes, later surfacing in Moscow within weeks. In one chilling memorandum dated October 3, 1939, a Soviet officer noted, "The German colleague provided cipher books, condition satisfactory, to be delivered to Lubyanka with urgency. If authentic, this proves that Britain's secrets passed through the same underground veins where Polish civilians starved." The most damning revelation, however, comes from the Allied side. In 1957, during a closed session of the Bundestag in Bonn, Western intelligence officers revealed fragments of captured documents from Soviet archives. The session minutes, still partially redacted, describe the exposure of temporary cooperation between Jekyll and Tsanova, Warsaw, 1939. This admission caused no public scandal, because it was never allowed to reach the public. Cold War politics demanded silence. For West Germany, accusing the Soviets risked breaking delicate negotiations over reunification. For NATO, revealing such collaboration would complicate the moral clarity of the war they had fought. And so the truth was buried again, deeper than the sewers that once carried it. For Poland, this knowledge is doubly cruel. The same sewers later became symbols of resistance during the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, when insurgents used them to launch surprise attacks against German occupiers. To know that those very tunnels once carried the signatures of betrayal, that beneath the boots of resistance fighters lay the echo of exchanged files and complicit silence, casts a long, unbearable shadow. The soil of Warsaw is not only soaked with blood, it is layered with deceit. When historians first reviewed these fragments, some dismissed them as Cold War fabrications, designed to sow mistrust between the Soviet Union and its former allies. Yet the consistency of names, dates, and surviving file codes makes fabrication unlikely. Too many independent archives, from Bletchley Park intercepts to Soviet command cables, point toward the same unsettling truth: that Hitler's Gestapo and Stalin's NKVD, for a brief but critical moment, shared not only territory, but the machinery of repression. It was not comradeship, but calculation. For the men of Z44, ideology was secondary to the practical work of eliminating opposition, securing resources, and erasing evidence. The war, as we know it, was fought with tanks, planes, and soldiers. But here, under Warsaw, it was fought with lists, with sealed envelopes, with signatures that condemned entire families without trial. These shadows remind us that the war's true horror was not only in open battle, but in the silence of underground corridors, where betrayal was written in ink and exchanged in the dark. And though decades have passed, the city still breathes with memory. Beneath Warsaw's rebuilt streets lies a hidden archive of stone and sewer water, whispering the truth that both victors and vanquished tried to erase. It is the forgotten Pact, and it is stained into the city's foundations forever. Chapter 2. Operation Iron Wolf's Vanished Convoy. The winter of 1945 fell harsh on East Prussia. Snow and smoke covered the shattered fields, and the retreating Wehrmacht dragged its last remnants westward under relentless Soviet fire. The city of Königsberg was surrounded, the Reich was collapsing. And yet amid this chaos, a single convoy departed under the codename Eisenwolf, Iron Wolf. Its existence was not acknowledged in Wehrmacht war diaries, and it does not appear in post-war Allied summaries of German retreats. Yet British decrypts from Bletchley Park, dated January 17, 1945, speak of an anomalous column, heavily guarded, westbound from Königsberg, watched with obsessive detail. The vanished convoy was not a mere evacuation of wounded or refugees. Declassified fragments suggest it carried the Reich's last gamble, a cargo of experimental uranium stockpiles intended for a desperate nuclear program, hidden from even many within the German High Command. Witness testimony, scattered across Soviet Smersh files and post-war interrogations, describes a column unlike any other. Local farmers reported that SS guards executed civilians who strayed near the road. One woman, identified in Soviet Archive 162B, recalled how 3 children who wandered too close to the convoy's flank were shot without warning. Another document, Bletchley Intercept HW41302, describes Luftwaffe patrols circling overhead, not to bomb, but to protect, shadowing the trucks with unusual persistence. The cargo was either invaluable or catastrophic. Soviet intelligence, aware of the column's departure, labeled it Priority 1, yet after it left Königsberg, the Iron Wolf vanished. The roots of the story lie in Germany's nuclear ambitions, a subject long buried beneath Allied triumphalism. In April 1945, when American forces captured the Heigerloch research reactor in southwestern Germany, they uncovered traces of uranium cubes, experimental designs, and scattered notes under Dr. Kurt Diebner's direction. Official accounts declared the program too primitive, too fractured, and too late to threaten the course of the war. But fragments of Heereswaffenamt files, hidden until the 1970s, reveal that Diebner's circle had prepared shipments eastward months earlier, moving material to protect it from Allied bombing. Königsberg, a city closer to the Eastern Front, may have served as a holding depot. From there, Operation Eisenwolf could have been the last desperate attempt to relocate these resources to safer ground, or to deliver them to collaborators seeking to bargain with either side. The convoy's path is described in fragments. Soviet records from the Second Belarusian Front mention an unusually defended motorized column sighted near the Pregel River. Maps in archive. Smersh 044 show red lines sketched around villages west of Königsberg, annotated with the words Eisenwolf Passage confirmed. Heavy SS escort. Yet after mid-January 1945, the trail abruptly stops. No Soviet report claims its capture. No German diary records its arrival. And no Allied interrogation transcript confesses its loss. It was as though the convoy dissolved into the snow. The British files CX and MSS-17, partially declassified in 1959, noted tersely, final whereabouts unknown, cargo unaccounted, probability of westward defection not excluded. The possibility that the convoy's uranium reached Western hands through surrender negotiations has haunted historians for decades. For the civilians trapped in East Prussia, the passage of Eisenwolf was a vision of terror. Villages stood in ruins. Survivors trudged through snow with carts carrying their last possessions. And yet this column moved untouched, immune to the chaos. The SS shot at looters, burned barns, and silenced anyone who saw too much. Survivors described tarpaulin-covered trucks, their wheels chained against the ice, flanked by armored cars. The insignia of the Totenkopf division appeared on some vehicles, men already infamous for their role in atrocities across occupied Europe. That such units were assigned to guard cargo instead of fighting at the front underscores its importance. And then there was the weather. Blizzards that swallowed roads, frozen rivers cracked beneath retreating troops. Yet Eisenwolf pushed westward as though bound by orders higher than survival itself. Speculation about the cargo has ranged from looted art to Nazi gold. Post-war treasure hunters have scoured lakes and forests for years, claiming Eisenwolf carried the amber room of Tsarskoye Selo, or bullion reserves plundered from occupied territories. Yet the consistency of Soviet and British references to uranium shipments cannot be dismissed. In 1992, a Russian historian uncovered a memorandum from the archives of the Ministry of Defense. It described intercepted convoy believed to carry fissile materials, destination unknown, loss of contact after January 22, 1945. The memo included a chilling annotation. Failure to secure cargo may explain delays in Soviet atomic progress. If true, the loss of Eisenwolf's uranium may have altered the balance of power in the early Cold War. The Americans, too, left cryptic hints. Operation Alsos, the Allied mission to capture German nuclear scientists and materials, documented dozens of shipments, but one section of its final report remains redacted to this day. Declassified fragments, however, mention eastward transfers redirected west under conditions unclear. General Leslie Groves, head of the Manhattan Project, later wrote in his memoirs that certain German materials fell into our hands through unusual channels. He gave no details, but the timing corresponds with Eisenwolf's disappearance. Did the convoy negotiate surrender to American lines, bypassing Soviet capture? Did its cargo, invisible in official inventories, fuel the rapid acceleration of the US atomic project in its final months? The silence of German officers after the war adds to the mystery. Interrogated generals spoke freely about lost divisions, collapsing defenses, even war crimes, but not Eisenwolf. When questioned about convoys from Königsberg, they feigned ignorance or claimed the chaos of retreat erased records. Yet one officer, Colonel Hans-Werner Scheidler, left a private letter to his family in 1946. Found decades later, it read, "There are things I saw that I cannot tell, for they will bury me if I do. The wolf went west, and I fear it will howl again." The letter was confiscated by British censors before it reached his wife, but a copy survived in MI6 archives, released in 1989. To imagine Eisenwolf is to see the dying Reich clutching at survival, trucks crawling through snow, guarded by desperate men with orders to kill without hesitation, villagers silenced, Allied interceptors circling above yet never firing, as if warned not to interfere, the cargo hidden beneath tarps, glowing with the weight of history. Perhaps uranium cubes stacked like bricks of a future never realized, perhaps documents of weapons design, traded for leniency by men who knew defeat was certain, and perhaps more than one set of hands reached for them. Soviet, British, American, each willing to bury the truth if it ensured advantage in the war to come. The trail ends, not in discovery, but in silence. No confirmed wreckage, no captured trucks, no survivors speaking decades later, only snow, ash, and whispers in declassified files. Operation Iron Wolf, the vanished convoy of Königsberg, stands as one of the war's most haunting mysteries, a reminder that in the dying months of the Reich, the future of atomic power, the lives of countless civilians, and the truth of secret bargains may have been carried westward on frozen roads, only to vanish forever into the white void of history. Chapter 3. The British Spy Buried in Berlin. The story of the man known only as Grey Fox is pieced together from scraps of intelligence reports, charred files pulled from the ruins of Berlin, and fragments of testimony long buried in the silence of Cold War secrecy. His codename appears first in MI6 archive CX-20117, dated late 1940, a file stamped for eyes only and circulated only among the highest levels of Britain's wartime intelligence hierarchy. His true identity remains classified to this day, but his mission was clear: to infiltrate the Nazi administrative corps in Berlin and provide the Allies with first-hand intelligence from the beating heart of the Reich. Grey Fox was no ordinary informant. He was a trained field officer, fluent in German, able to navigate Berlin's bureaucratic labyrinth with a false identity so convincing that even Gestapo counterintelligence never suspected him, at least not at first. Grey Fox's reports, transmitted via microdots smuggled inside diplomatic pouches and neutral couriers, carried weight that echoed through the war rooms of London. In late 1941, months before the Wannsee Conference codified the final solution, his messages warned of mass killings in Poland, describing movements of Einsatzgruppen and the systematic targeting of Jewish communities and Polish elites. One surviving microdot, magnified and preserved in MI6's technical archive, contains his chilling words: "It is no longer shootings in the forest. Camps are constructed for permanent removal. The scale is beyond comprehension." His intelligence, if acted upon fully, might have altered the pace of Allied awareness of the Holocaust. Yet in the fog of war, amidst competing reports and political caution, his warnings were not publicized. Grey Fox remained alone, watching genocide unfold from within the enemy's walls. The last confirmed transmission from Grey Fox reached London in March 1942. After that, silence. No further microdots, no coded phrases slipped into diplomatic letters. The blackout was abrupt, and MI6 handlers feared the worst. They were correct. In May 1945, as Allied troops combed through the wreckage of Berlin, a burned Gestapo file was recovered from Prince Albrecht Strasse, the headquarters of Himmler's feared secret police. Among the ashes, one surviving fragment, marked Gestapo File Number 17, described the execution of a foreign agent, likely British, by order of RSHA Department 4. The file gave no name, only a reference to Agent Fuchs Grau, Grey Fox in German. The location, a basement chamber beneath Gestapo headquarters. The method, a single shot to the back of the head. No body was recorded, no grave listed. His life ended in silence, erased by men who specialized in erasure. For decades, British intelligence denied his existence. Official war histories published in the 1950s and 1960s made no mention of a field officer operating in Berlin. Files were sealed, references struck from records, and when inquiries arose, officials claimed the codename Grey Fox referred to a defunct cipher system, not a man. But Soviet archives, opened briefly after the fall of the USSR, tell another story. In KGB file series LUB 309, seized from Berlin in 1945, Grey Fox's name appeared again. Soviet intelligence officers reported intercepting whispers of betrayal within Allied ranks, that his cover had not been blown by the Gestapo's brilliance, but by a leak in Allied intelligence itself. A British double agent, possibly tied to the Cambridge spy ring, may have identified him to the Germans. If true, his death was not simply an execution by enemies, but a murder facilitated by allies. The suspicion of betrayal corroded post-war trust between Britain and the United States, both fearful that infiltrators had compromised the very core of their operations. One haunting detail emerges in the post-war interrogations of Gestapo officer Walter Schellenberg. While testifying at Nuremberg, Schellenberg mentioned an unnamed British spy caught like a fox in his own den. The phrase seemed casual at the time, but decades later, when cross-referenced with Grey Fox's codename, it read as confirmation. Schellenberg died in 1952, but his words remain one of the few direct acknowledgements of the spy's capture. Other fragments, letters confiscated by censors, marginalia scrawled in Soviet dossiers, suggest Grey Fox was buried in haste near Tempelhof airfield, his body tossed into a shallow trench, along with dozens of other unnamed prisoners executed in the Reich's final months. The rubble of Allied bombing and Soviet artillery swallowed the site. Today, no trace remains. Beneath the runways and warehouses of modern Berlin, the unmarked grave of Britain's forgotten agent likely still lies. What makes Grey Fox's story so haunting is not only his death, but his erasure. Unlike other spies immortalized in memoirs and films, his name was deleted from history. His deeds silenced, even as lesser operatives were celebrated. The decision was deliberate. Protecting other agents embedded in Europe meant denying his existence. Admitting a betrayal within Allied intelligence would have shattered confidence at a fragile moment when the West faced the Soviet threat. And so Grey Fox became a ghost, known only to archivists and the classified margins of Cold War bureaucracy. When fragments of his file were declassified in 1987, journalists who requested his story found only blacked-out pages and vague references to unconfirmed sources. His true identity remains under lock and key, perhaps forever, yet the questions linger. Who was he? Some believe Grey Fox was a Cambridge-educated officer. Others argue he was a Polish exile trained in Britain and smuggled back into the Reich. A few even suggest he was German himself, a defector who used his native tongue to blend seamlessly into Nazi administration. None of these theories can be proven. What is known is that his intelligence was real, his sacrifice unquestionable, and his silence absolute. His microdots, tiny worlds of ink, remain preserved like relics. Warnings ignored, but warnings nonetheless. The historian who uncovered file CX210117 in 2003 described reading his words as touching the voice of a ghost that warned, pleaded and died in darkness, erased by friend and foe alike. To stand in modern Berlin, near the site of the Gestapo headquarters on Niederkirchner Straße, is to walk on haunted ground. The air is heavy, the ruins preserved as memorials. Yet beneath lies the memory of men like Grey Fox. His story, once denied, now emerges through cracks in archives and whispers of files once marked top secret. He was buried without a name, erased without honor, but his shadow remains, a silent testament to the hidden war that unfolded in the corridors of power and the basements of terror. Grey Fox's fate is a reminder that espionage is not only about codes and secrets, it is about lives extinguished in silence, their truth buried deeper than the rubble of the Reich they dared to infiltrate. Chapter 4: Stalin's Secret Deal over Prague, May 1945. The war in Europe was gasping its final breaths. Berlin had fallen, Hitler was dead, and across the continent, civilians looked toward liberation with hope and desperation. In Prague, the heart of Czechoslovakia, that hope turned into action. On May 5th, resistance fighters rose against German occupation, seizing radio stations, barricading streets, and broadcasting frantic pleas for help. The uprising was desperate but determined, fueled by the belief that Soviet forces under Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front were only days away. Yet what followed remains one of the most chilling revelations in the declassified Soviet archive. Orders marked Directive 728K, instructing Soviet units to halt outside the city and allow events to burn themselves out. Prague was left to bleed, sacrificed on the altar of Stalin's political calculation. The uprising itself was chaotic and brave. Armed with stolen rifles, Molotov cocktails, and sheer defiance, Czech civilians overwhelmed small German garrisons, capturing weapons and turning them against their occupiers. The city echoed with gunfire, church bells, and radio appeals. Messages broadcast on the seized Prague radio station begged for immediate Allied intervention. "Prague is in danger," one voice pleaded. "We beg you, do not abandon us." Yet even as these words crackled across Europe, the Red Army stood silent just outside the city, its vast columns of tanks and artillery inexplicably unmoving. Declassified Stavka orders, bearing Stalin's own authorization, explain why. A secret agreement with German commanders allowed Wehrmacht units to withdraw westward and surrender to American forces rather than fall into Soviet hands. The bargain ensured Stalin would control Czechoslovakia once the dust settled, but at the cost of thousands of Czech lives. The brutality inflicted on Prague in those days was staggering. German reprisals swept through the city with ferocity. SS units, cornered and desperate, executed civilians en masse, shot hostages in town squares, and shelled districts held by partisans. Gestapo files later recovered listed entire neighborhoods marked for exemplary punishment. Flames consumed factories, schools, and apartment blocks. Eyewitnesses recalled black smoke blotting out the sky, while Soviet artillery sat silent across the Vltava, ordered not to advance. A diary from a Red Army captain smuggled west in 1962 described the frustration among soldiers ready to storm the city. "We heard their cries on the radio," he wrote. "We could see the fire on the horizon. Orders came, wait. So we waited, and they died." Across the front line, the Americans watched in equal frustration. General George S. Patton's Third Army had reached western Bohemia and was poised to drive into Prague. His armored columns were less than a day's march away. But orders from Eisenhower, dictated by political agreements at Yalta, forbade him from advancing further east. Prague, by Allied agreement, lay within the Soviet sphere. To cross that line risked fracturing the fragile alliance, even as the war drew to a close. Patton reportedly raged at the decision, calling it a betrayal of those who fight for freedom. Yet his hands were tied. American troops remained stationary, while Czech partisans, abandoned by both East and West, were left to face German wrath alone. The cost was horrific. Between May 5 and May 8th, estimates suggest between 7,000 and 10,000 civilians and resistance fighters were killed. Entire districts of Prague were scarred by artillery, executions, and reprisal burnings. German troops, knowing surrender to the Soviets, meant brutal captivity or death, fought with desperate cruelty, lashing out at civilians in an orgy of violence before retreating west. The uprising ended in blood, its leaders executed, its fighters massacred. Only when German forces finally surrendered on May 9th did Soviet tanks roll into the city, not as saviors, but as calculated victors stepping onto ground already soaked in blood. Directive 728K, uncovered in Soviet archives in 1991, revealed the ruthless clarity of Stalin's strategy. The cable instructed Konev's forces: delay entry to Prague until German withdrawal is complete. Avoid unnecessary losses of Soviet soldiers. Ensure political control upon entry. In other words, Prague's agony was acceptable so long as the Soviet Union emerged as unchallenged master. To Stalin, the Czech resistance was expendable. The people's sacrifice weakened German defenses, cleared the way for Soviet occupation, and denied the Americans any chance of gaining influence in Czechoslovakia. Liberation was not delivered. It was delayed, manipulated, and used as a weapon of political control. The betrayal reverberated long after the war. Survivors of the uprising, many who had fought believing in Allied promises, found themselves under Soviet-backed communist rule within 3 years. The memory of their sacrifice was rewritten in official propaganda, transformed into a tale of Soviet liberation rather than abandonment. The names of fallen partisans were celebrated in state parades, but the truth of how they were left to die was buried beneath censorship. Only in secret, whispered in kitchens and hidden in samizdat texts, did the story of Stalin's calculated betrayal survive. Western intelligence knew more than they admitted. Declassified US reports from 1946 show awareness of Stalin's deal, but officials kept silent. Exposing it would have shattered the post-war illusion of Allied unity and threatened already fragile negotiations over Germany's division. Instead, silence prevailed, and Prague's truth was erased from mainstream history. Only with the collapse of the Soviet Union did the archives open, revealing what survivors had long known: that their uprising had been used as bait in a ruthless geopolitical trap. To stand in Prague today, among the cobblestone streets and Gothic spires, is to walk on ground scarred by betrayal. The uprising of May 1945 remains a symbol of courage but also of abandonment. The charred ruins have long been rebuilt, but the declassified Directive 728K ensures that the truth cannot be buried again. Stalin's secret deal over Prague was not liberation delayed by chance. It was a deliberate choice to let a city burn so the Soviet Union could emerge unchallenged, and the ghosts of those lost still linger in the alleys, whispering of a freedom promised but never delivered. In the shadows of forgotten archives, 4 hidden files have emerged, each peeling away the facade of official history and revealing the war as it truly was: ruthless, calculated, and filled with betrayals that scarred nations long after the guns fell silent. Beneath the streets of Warsaw, sewers that once carried the footsteps of resistance also carried the signatures of treachery, where Gestapo and NKVD couriers exchanged lists that sealed lives in death camps. On the frozen roads of East Prussia, a convoy under the codename Eisenwolf vanished into the snow, its tarpaulin-shrouded cargo never found, leaving behind only whispers that uranium meant for Hitler's final weapon may have fueled another superpower's atomic dawn. In Berlin, the story of Grey Fox remains buried, a British spy erased not only by a Gestapo bullet, but by his own government's silence. Betrayed by a leak that turned his mission into a death sentence and his memory into an absence. And in Prague, Stalin's cold directive condemned a city to fire so that his Red Army could march in as conquerors, not rescuers, reshaping Europe's heartland in iron shadows. Each of these truths, hidden in file codes, code names, and redacted testimonies, reminds us that the war was never the clean battle of liberation depicted in parades and textbooks. It was a contest fought in corridors, basements, and secret orders, where human lives were mere bargaining chips in the hands of men who measured victory in power, not in blood saved. And still, as the ink of those directives bleeds through time, the question lingers: how many more buried files remain sealed, waiting to reveal that the war we remember is not the war that truly was?